everybody, welcome back to Go Read Some Comics with me, Professor Jenna. I put out a call recently for the questions about comic books or superhero media that you've always had but maybe been a little afraid to ask, and I got some really interesting responses, some of which I almost feel like I could make an entire video about independently. I'm going to try my best to answer as many of them as humanly possible, so let's dive in. I'm starting with two questions that kind of go hand in hand. They are, as someone who wants to get into comics, how do I start? Like, is it better to read from the beginning, or are there certain points where you can start and not feel overwhelmed by the stuff that's happened in issues before? What's the best way to know what to follow if you just want a semi-linear narrative? Do you pick a run, a series, an event, a character from the beginning? I feel like there are a million ways to answer this question, and it really depends on what you want out of the world of comics. Do you just want the vibe of an entire universe, or is there a certain character or team that you want to dive in on, and how prolific are they? I do think if you have a hyper-specific quest like that, it can be fun to read in chronological order. I have done it multiple times for my favorite characters, and it's a very gratifying experience, but you definitely don't have to do that. You can easily just jump around on the runs or the comics that interest you, and either do the research yourself or hope that they fill in the gaps. Even then, I will argue that almost every comic reader's first comic for a particular universe or character isn't something perfectly accessible. It's just a story that crossed their path at a very specific time and resonated with them. Is there a guide somewhere to the entire run by an author for a character? There are multiple. Depending on which character you're looking for, there are plenty of fan-made ones across Tumblr, Twitter threads, and all of that. In terms of more centralized resources, Comic Books Reading Order and Comic Book Herald both have plenty of lists, and they're either listed in single issues or trades. I would also recommend looking at their page on the DC or Marvel wiki because they can narrow down your search really quickly. What comics would you recommend to someone for the upcoming Superman movie? All-Star Superman and Superman for All Seasons are definitely at the top of that list. I would also personally recommend the most recent run of Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen just to get a general vibe for Metropolis and the Daily Planet culture. I could get extremely into the weeds recommending books for the other heroes that are in the movie, but Justice League International and the Terrifics are good places to start. I haven't read many comics, but I love Marvel and DC. I think I want to start with Daredevil comics. I love the Netflix series. Have any recommendations on where to start? You really can't go wrong with Charles Soule, Mark Waid, or Chip Zdarsky's runs. Honestly, just pick whichever of those storylines sounds the coolest to you and go from there. Where to start reading Sam Wilson's Captain America? Specifically with Sam's tenure as Cap, I would really recommend just starting at the beginning of when he took on the mantle in 2012. There are complete collections available of both of those runs, as well as plenty of single issues you can probably track down. The more recent Captain America Symbol of Truth and Cold War miniseries are also great. I'm a plus-size woman and was wondering if there are any female superheroes and or love interests that look like me, and if not, do you think there ever will or could be? I definitely think we could use more, but there are plenty that are already available and are wonderful. I cannot recommend Faith Herbert, aka Zephyr, enough. She is a telekinetic superhero who's published by Valiant, and her more recent comics written by Jodie Hauser are so much fun. A movie about her has kind of been in development hell for a while, but she is still someone that I would love to see on screen. Also, I would recommend diving into Etta Candy and Stampa from DC and Gert Yorks from Marvel's Runaways. How come more publications haven't followed the Hellboy model of having one primary writer and artist with a single continuous vision instead of switching between multiple teams over a series lifespan? In my mind, it's three things. Number one, it's the editorial plans of the publisher and whether or not they want to reboot or radically shake up the character at some point for some larger initiative or just to boost sales. Number two, it's the popularity of the character. In this present moment, it's much more of a gamble to have a single writer on an A-list character for hundreds of issues than on a lesser known character. And number three, it's whether or not the creator actually wants to work on the character in the long term on a monthly schedule. Mike Mignola on Hellboy and Todd McFarlane on the main Spawn book are Herculean tenures in this industry. Chip Zdarsky on Daredevil or Tom King on Batman have become exceptions and not rules, unfortunately. I've always wondered how writers come up with stories for characters with 50 plus years of lore behind them. Do they read an abridged history, or do the editing rooms have resident historians or something in them? It really depends on the character and the time at which the story was written. There were so many creators in the Silver and Bronze Ages who grew up with the canon as kids and felt a responsibility to honor it and have an encyclopedic knowledge of it. My favorite is Marvel editor Mark Grunwald, who became so well known as their continuity expert that he inspired a certain continuity-focused character who's now in a certain TV show.
I'm Agent Mobius, by the way.
I could talk about that for hours. But there hasn't been a universally perfect track record, which is actually how we get some of the reboots and attempts at clean slates like Crisis and the New 52. It seems like in a modern context, the creative team and the editor are either already fans of the specific lore or are able to research anything that they're directly referencing. I will say it is easier than ever to do that in our current moment. Between having digital backlogs of comics and all of the fan-made wikis, why are there so many runs on the same characters at any given time, i.e. Batman and Spider-Man? Part of it is tradition, like having Detective Comics and Batman be two separate titles. In a way, it's also to cast as wide of a net as possible for potential readers instead of going all in on something super gritty or super lighthearted and potentially alienating the readers who don't want that kind of story. It's also kind of reflecting a change in the industry in a way. 30 or 40 years ago, there's a chance that some of the stories being published now as 6-issue minis or graphic novels would have just been an arc shoehorned into the main character's book with no alternative to fans. Why don't superheroes age? Some do if there's narrative potential in acknowledging their legacy or their relationship to the younger generation, but most don't because it's a fantasy world, and the format of comics kind of allows the publisher to portray them in their prime for as long as they want them to be. Canonically, they don't age because of something called the sliding timescale, which smushes events closer together as more events happen in the canon. There's a whole separate conversation to be had about how long that timescale actually is in both universes and how many attempts at doing that didn't even see the light of day. How do secret bases get built? It depends on the building. Some things like the Avengers Mansion or the Baxter Building or the JSA Brownstone could have easily just been constructed and contracted as typical buildings. Other times, like with the Hall of Justice, the heroes themselves canonically build it. The Batcave is somewhere in between this. It's established in canon that generations of the Wayne family used the structure for various things over the years, including the Underground Railroad, so Bruce could have easily contracted the crew to make additions to it as a panic room or a storage space or something more typical. Why does every multiversal event have to have millions of potentially cool alternate takes on characters die horribly? The simplest answer is it allows the event to have casualties and stakes without sacrificing characters that already have a narrative potential of their own. A lot of times these blink and you'll miss it alternate versions seem cool, but they might be difficult to actually build a satisfying narrative around. I feel like the recent What If finale really illustrates this in spades. As cool as some of those combo characters are, there are really only so many that have enough of a story to justify an entire episode. Why is there so much online and in-world discussion over comic characters' sexual appeal and how freaky some of these said characters are behind closed doors? As an Arrow ace, I am often surprised by how frequent these discussions are and how passionate some fans are on this topic. I think there is a lot to say about this topic, and it's something that I would love to make an entire video about if I could just figure out how to monetize and package it correctly. But I think the simplest way of answering it is there are already so many love stories and relationship dramas used for stakes in superhero comics, so it's easy for fans to imagine what's happening off the page. This is especially true amid the shipping and fan fiction and fan art of the 21st century. A version of that has arguably happened throughout the history of superhero media, whether in innuendo references or in the actual canon. I feel like it comes out of this subconscious desire to ground these larger-than-life characters in emotion, and to run wild with the power sets and the strong characterizations that already exist on the page. I'll also argue that some of that conversation even predates the modern superhero, when you look back at the ways that people wrote about the gods and other folk heroes of fiction. Part of it also feels like a subconscious rebellion against censorship, either of the anti-comic sentiment of the 1950s or of the current backlash against sex scenes and all of those things in our pop culture. I recommend looking into the book Super Sex, Sexuality, Fantasy, and the Superhero by Anna F. Peppard if you want to read even more about it. Do you believe it would be possible for a comic book, graphic novel, or manga to be written in Braille and be completely accessible to the blind and visually impaired? There are some instances of this happening in other countries, and it would definitely be cool to see it on a more widespread level. In the meantime, there are tons of audio series and audio adaptations of comics that are hoping to fill the void. I think we can agree fridging is a bad trope, but where does the line exist between fridging and proper motivation spurred by a character's death? I love this question, and it's also something I could make an entire video about. I think it has to do with the optics and the power dynamics of a particular story. There are countless instances of character deaths that have genuine seismic narrative stakes, and a character or characters being motivated in the aftermath of that. Fridging, to me, is not only the act of killing or maiming a character, but dehumanizing them and taking away their power for the sake of another character. It can happen to characters who were powerful enough to stop what happened to them, or to civilians, but it's about taking any of their power away and giving it to a third party, either out of revenge or to move the narrative along. Like I said, I feel like this is a topic I could make an entire separate video about, as depressing as that would be, because there's a lot of nuance in the discussion. Are the Watchers multiversal beings in the comics, or do they exist in each universe? Technically, they exist in each universe, as the Ultimate Universe and Earth X each have their own Watchers, but trust me, given the nature of the multiverse, you are not alone in being confused by that. Am I weird for not liking when the Bat family is too large? Not at all. I love that these characters are all under the same umbrella, but purely from a comic storytelling standpoint, I do think it creates an interesting dilemma when you put too much of the Bat family in a particular story. Those stories might run the risk of a character's skill set or role or gimmick being redundant with another character, or them just being flanderized down to one or two very small personality traits. It's worse if a certain character isn't already in their own book, because it means that the main outlet we get of them in modern publishing is them just kind of stuck like an NPC. Are the Thing's organs also rocks, and if they are, does his poop also turn into rocks? The first movie does show him with rocky internal organs, but nothing in the comics has really proven that. He technically just has the rock exoskeleton, so I would assume that everything else underneath is normal. And finally, do superheroes poop? Yes. What's a question about comics or superheroes that you've always wondered about? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and please don't forget to like and subscribe and share if you haven't already done so. If you haven't already, please follow me on social media at Hey It's Jenna Lynn. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, go read some comics.